Well, today, like it or not, we actually begin the life of Johnson. The Life of Samuel Johnson, LLD. To write the life of him who excelled all mankind in writing the lives of others, and who, whether we consider his extraordinary endowments or his various works, has been equaled by few in any age, is an arduous and may be reckoned in me a presumptuous task. Had Dr. Johnson written his whole life in conformity with the opinion which he has given, that every man's life may be best written by himself, had he employed in the preservation of his own history that clearness of narration and elegance of language in which he has embalmed so many eminent persons, the world would probably have had the most perfect example of biography that was ever exhibited. But although he at different times, in a desultory manner, committed to writing many particulars of the progress of his mind and fortunes, he never had persevering diligence enough to form them into a regular composition. Of these memorials, a few have been preserved. The greater part was consigned by him to the flames a few days before his death. As I had the honor and happiness of enjoying his friendship for upwards of 20 years, as I had the shame of writing his life constantly in view, as he was well apprised of this circumstance and from time to time obligingly satisfied my inquiries by communicating to me the incidents of his early years, as I acquired a facility in recollecting and was very assiduous in recording his conversation, of which the extraordinary vigor and vivacity constituted one of the first features of his character, and as I have spared no pains in obtaining materials concerning him for every quarter where I could discover that there were to be found, and have been favored with the most liberal communications by his friends, I flatter myself that few biographers have entered upon such a work as this with more advantages, independent of literary abilities, in which I am not vain enough to compare myself with some great names who had gone before me in this kind of writing. Since my work was announced, several lives and memoirs of Dr. Johnson have been published, the most voluminous of which is one compiled by the booksellers of London by Sir John Hopkins, Knight, a man whom, during my long intimacy with Dr. Johnson, I never saw in his company, I think but once, and I am sure not above twice. Here we have a footnote. The greatest part of this book was written while Sir John Hawkins was alive, and I avow that one object of my strictures was to make him feel some compunction for his illiberal treatment of Dr. Johnson. Since his decease, I have suppressed several of my remarks upon his work, but though I would not war with the dead offensively, I think it's necessary to be strenuous in defense of my illustrious friend, which I cannot be without strong aversion upon a writer who has greatly injured him. Let me add that though I doubt I should not have been very prompt to gratify Sir John Hawkins with my compliment in his lifetime, I do now frankly acknowledge that, in my opinion, his volume, however inadequate and improper as the life of Dr. Johnson, and however discredited by unpardonable inaccuracies in other respects, contains a collection of curious anecdotes and observations which few men but its author could have brought together. Anyway, back to the thing at hand. Johnson might have esteemed him for his decent, religious demeanor and his knowledge of books and literary history, but from the rigid formality of his manners, it is evident that they never could have lived together with companionable ease and familiarity, nor had Sir John Hawkins that nice perception which was necessary to mark the finer and less obvious parts of Johnson's character. His being appointed one of his executors gave him an opportunity of taking possession of some fragments of a diary and other papers as were left, of which, before delivering them up to the residuary legatee, whose property they were, he endeavored to extract the substance. In this he has not been very successful, as I have found upon a perusal of those papers, which have been since transferred to me. Sir John Hawkins's ponderous labours, I must acknowledge, exhibit a farrago, of which a considerable portion is not devoid of entertainment to the lovers of literary gossiping. But besides it being swelled out with long, unnecessary extracts from various works, even one of several leaves from Osborne's Harleian Catalogue, and those not compiled by Johnson, but by Oldies, a very small part of it relates to the person who is the subject of the book. And in that, there is such an inaccuracy in the statements of facts, as is in so solemn an author, is hardly excusable, and certainly makes his narrative very unsatisfactory. But what is still worse, there is throughout the whole of it a dark, uncharitable cast by which the most unfavorable construction is put upon almost every circumstance in the character and conduct of my illustrious friend, who, I trust, will, by a true and fair delineation, be vindicated both from the injuries, misrepresentations of this author, and from the slighter aspirations of a lady who once lived in a great intimacy with him. Mrs. Thrale, the footnote says. There is, in the British Museum, a letter from Bishop Warburton to Dr. Birch on the subject of biography, which, though I am aware it may expose me to a charge of artfully raising the value of my own works, by contrasting it with that of which I have spoken, is so well conceived and expressed that I cannot refrain from here inserting it. Here it in quotes. I shall endeavor, says Dr. Warburton, to give you what satisfaction I can in anything you want to be satisfied in on ye subject of Milton. And I am extremely glad you intend to write his life. Almost all the life writers we have had before Toland and Desmassois are indeed strange, insipid creatures. And yet I had rather read the worst of them than be obliged to go through with this of Milton's or the other's life of Boileau, where there is such a dull, heavy succession of long quotations of disinterested passages that it makes their method quite nauseous. But the verbose, tasteless Frenchmen seem to lay it down as a principle that every little life must be a book, and what's worse, it proves a book without a life. For what do we know of Boileau, after all, is tedious stuff. You are the only one, and I speak it without a compliment, that by the vigor of your style and sentiments, and the real importance of your materials, have the art, which one would imagine no one could have missed, of adding agreements to the most agreeable subjects of the world, which is literary history. November 24th, 1737. Instead of melting down my materials into one mass, and constantly speaking in my own persons, by which I might have appeared to have more merit in the execution of the work, I resolved to adapt and enlarge upon the excellent plan of Mr. Mason in his Memoirs of Gray. Wherever narrative is necessary to explain, connect, and supply, I furnish it to the best of my abilities. But in the chronological series of Johnson's life, which I trace as distinctly as I can, year by year, I produce, wherever it is in my power, his own minutes, letters of conversation, being convinced that the mode is more lively and will make my readers better acquainted with him than even most of those who actually knew him, but could know him only partially. Whereas there is here, by an accumulation of intelligence from various points, by which his character is more fully understood and illustrated. Indeed, I cannot conceive a more perfect mode of writing any man's life than not only relating all the most important events of it in their order, but interweaving what he privately wrote and said and thought, by which mankind are enabled, as it were, to see him live, and to live or each sane with him, as he actually advanced through the several stages of his life. Had his own friends seen as diligent and ardent as I were, he might have been almost entirely preserved. As it is, I will venture to say that he will be seen in this work more completely than any man was ever yet lived. It's quite a statement, huh? And he will be seen as he really was, for I profess to write not his panegyric, which must be all praise, but his life, which, great and good as he was, must not be supposed to be entirely perfect. To be as he was is indeed subject of panegyric enough, panegyric, Panegyrick. See, if I... Yeah. Enough to any man in the state of being. But in every picture there should be shades as well as light. And when I delineate him without reserve, I do what he himself recommended, both by his precepts and his example. If the biographer writes from the personal knowledge and makes haste to gratify the public curiosity, there is danger lest his interest, his fear, his gratitude, or his tenderness overpower his fidelity and tempt him to conceal, if not to invent. I believe this is a quote from Samuel Johnson right now. There are many who think if an act of piety to hide the faults of fallings of their friends, even when they can no longer suffer by their detection. We therefore see whole ranks of characters adorned with uniform panegyric, and not to be known from one another but by extrinsic and casual circumstances. Let me remember, says Hale, when I find myself inclined to pity a criminal, that there is likewise a pity due to their country. If we owe regard to the memory of the dead, there is yet more respect to be paid to knowledge, to virtue, and to truth. That's from The Rambler, issue number 60. Back to Boswell's voice now. When I consider, as the peculiar value of the following work, is the quantity that it contains of Johnson's conversation, which is universally acknowledged to have been eminently instructive and entertaining, and of which the specimens that I have given upon a former occasion have been received with so much approbation that I have good grounds for supposing that the world will not be indifferent to more ample communications of a similar nature. That the conversation of a celebrated man and his talents have been exerted in conversation will best display his character is, I trust, too well established in the judgment of mankind to be at all shaken by a sneering observation of Mr. Mason in his Memoirs of Mr. William Whitehead, in which there is literally no life, but a mere dry narrative of facts. I do not think it was quite necessary to attempt a depreciation of what is universally esteemed, because it was not to be found in the immediate object of the ingenious writer's pen. For in truth, from a man so still and so tame as to be contented to pass many years as the domestic companion of the superannuated lord and lady, conversation worth recording could no more be expected than from a Chinese mandarin on a chimney-piece, or the fantastic figures on a gilt leather screen. If authority be required, let us appeal to Plutarch, the prince of ancient biographers. There is now a string of Greek, which I cannot even pretend to pronounce, because it's in Greek. It's all Greek to me. I don't know if it's... Oh, I think there's a translation here now. Nor is it always in the most distinguished achievements that men's virtues of vice must be discerned. But very often an action of small note, a short saying, or a jest shall distinguish a person's real character more than the greatest sieges or the most important battles. That's from Plutarch's Life of Alexander. To this may be added the sentiments of the very man whose life I am about to exhibit. And here's a quoted section. The business of the biographer is often to pass slightly over those performances and incidents which produce vulgar greatness, to lead the thoughts into domestic privacies, and display the minute details of daily life, where exterior appendages are cast aside and men excel each other only by prudence and by virtue. The account of Thanes is with very great propriety said by its author to have been written that it might lay open to posterity the private and familiar character of that man, cujus ingenium et caderum ipsius scriptus sunt olim semper merituri, whose candor and genius will be in the end of time be by his writings preserved in admiration. There are many invisible circumstances which, whether we read and inquire after natural or moral knowledge, whether we intend to enlarge our science or increase our virtue, are more important than public occurrences. Thus Sallust, the great master of nature, has not forgot in his account of Catiline to remark that his walk was now quick and again slow, as an indication of a mind revolving with violent commotion. Thus the story of Melanchthon affords a striking lecture on the value of time, by informing us that when he had made an appointment, he expected not only the hour, but the minute to be fixed, that the day might not run out in the idleness of suspense. And all the plans and enterprises of De Witt are now of less importance to the world than that part of his personal character which represents him as careful of his health and negligent of his life. But biography has often been allowed to writers who seem very little acquainted with the nature of their tasks, or very negligent about the performance. They rarely afford any other account than might be collected from public papers, but imagine themselves writing a life, when they exhibit a chronological series of actions or a performance, and have so little regard to the manners of behavior of their heroes that more knowledge may be gained of a man's real character by a short conversation with one of his servants than from a formal and studied narrative begun with his pedigree and ended with his funeral. There are indeed some natural reasons why these narratives are often written by such as were not likely to give much instructive or delight, and why most accounts of particular persons are barren and useless. If a life be delayed till interest and envies are at an end, we may hope for partiality, but must expect little intelligence. For the incidents which give excellence to biography are of a volatile and effervescent kind, such as soon escape the memory and are transmitted by tradition. We know how few can portray a living acquaintance except by his most prominent and observable particularities, and the grosser features of his mind. And it may be easily imagined how much of this little knowledge may be lost in imparting it, and how soon a succession of copies will lose all resemblance of the original. That was Samuel Johnson's actual words, I believe, from The Rambler, issue number 60 again. Well, I guess I'll stop for today. Well, it's okay so far, I guess. We'll see. Still pretty early on in. Oh, yeah. Anyway, bye from Boswell.